Hey there and welcome. Today we're diving into a really core question in ecology. How do you actually take the pulse of an entire species? We're not talking about a single animal here, we're talking about understanding the vital signs of the whole group. So let's get right into it.
Just think about that for a second. For one person or one animal, you might check their temperature, their heart rate. Easy enough. But for an entire species, you've got to zoom way out. The question completely changes from how is this one deer doing to how is the entire forest's deer population functioning as a single unit. And that shift in perspective, well, that's what ecology is all about.
So before we can even start measuring these group-level vital signs, we have to be absolutely crystal clear on what we're measuring. What exactly is a population? Okay, this definition here is super precise, and trust me, every single part of it matters. Same species, okay, that's a given. Defined area, that gives us our boundaries, right? Like all the tigers in a specific reserve. But it's that last part, capable of interbreeding. That is the real engine behind it all. It means they're all sharing a gene pool, and that's what allows a population to evolve and stick around. If you miss any one of those pieces, you're not really talking about a true population. And this brings us to probably the most important distinction you need to grasp. See, an individual is born and an individual dies. That's it. But a population has a birth rate and a death rate. It seems like a small change in words, but it's the absolute foundation of population dynamics. We're moving away from individual stories to see the big picture patterns of the group.
To make this a little easier, let's think of these characteristics like a dashboard for a population's health. We've got four main gauges we need to keep our eyes on: density, natality, mortality, and the sex ratio. Let's break down each one. First up on our dashboard is the pressure gauge, population density. This is all about answering the question, how crowded is it in here? Is it 10 oak trees per hectare or 1,000? Just knowing that one number tells you so much about the pressure on resources and how much competition is going on. But, density isn't always that simple. Check out the difference here between crude and ecological density. Imagine some fish living in a lake. The crude density is just the number of fish divided by the lake's entire surface area. But what if those fish can only really live in the shallow, warmer parts? Well, the ecological density, the number of fish in the space they can actually use, is going to be much, much higher. And that's the number that really tells you about the competition they're facing. So how in the world do we get these numbers? Let's be real, you can't count every single mouse in a field. So ecologists use some pretty clever sampling methods. For plants or other stationary things, they might use a quadrat, which is basically just a square frame they randomly toss. For animals, they use cool techniques like mark and recapture. The key thing to remember is that these are all smart estimates. They're not perfect head counts.
Okay, next gauge on our dashboard, the inflow. This is natality, or what we commonly call the birth rate. This is the main way a population brings in new members. It's really the engine of population growth. But not all birth rates are created equal. You've got maximum natality, which is the absolute theoretical potential under perfect, ideal conditions. We're talking unlimited food, no predators, perfect weather, the whole shebang. It's a biological constant for a species. Then you have ecological natality. This is the actual birth rate we see out in the real world, which is of course always lower because of all those real-world limits. Just remember, maximum natality is a biological fantasy, a perfect world scenario. Ecological natality is the reality on the ground.
So if natality is our inflow gauge, it has to be balanced by an outflow gauge, right? And that's mortality, the death rate. This is simply the rate at which individuals are removed from the population, whether it's from predators, disease, starvation, or just old age. And just like with natality, we've got two types here. Minimum mortality is the death rate in that same perfect, ideal world where the only thing you die from is old age. Ecological mortality is what's actually happening out in nature with all the dangers that come with it. So of course, the real-world mortality rate is always going to be higher than that ideal minimum. It just makes sense. A really cool way to visualize these mortality patterns is with something called a survivorship curve. It basically shows us when death is most likely to happen in a species' life. For type 1 species, like us humans, most of us make it to old age. For type 2, like a lot of birds, the risk of dying is pretty much constant throughout life. And for type 3, like an oyster that releases millions of eggs, there's a huge die-off right at the start, but the very few that survive that initial period can live for a really long time. All right, our final gauge on the dashboard is the balance indicator, the sex ratio.
Now, this might seem pretty simple, but the proportion of males to females can have a massive, massive impact on where a population is headed. So we can measure the sex ratio right at fertilization, or at birth, but the one that really tells us about the future reproductive potential is the tertiary sex ratio. That's the ratio in the adult reproducing population. Why does that one matter so much? Well, because they're the ones actually making the next generation. A population of 1,000 caribou sounds healthy, but if only 10 of them are female, its potential for growth is incredibly limited. So, we have our 4 gauges: density, natality, mortality, and sex ratio. But here's where things get really cool. These vital signs don't just exist in a vacuum. They're constantly influencing each other, creating this incredible, dynamic balancing act. This is a classic example of what we call density-dependent regulation. It's a natural feedback loop. Just follow the flow here with me. As the population gets more crowded, density goes up, right? That means more competition for everything: food, nesting sites, you name it. That stress naturally makes the birth rate go down and the death rate go up. And what's the result? The population's growth slows down and things stabilize. It's like nature's own built-in thermostat. Okay, let's switch gears for a second and focus on some high-value advice. Understanding these ideas is one thing, but knowing how to avoid the common traps is what really helps you master the material. So let's look at 3 things that often trip people up. First trap: natality is not the same as fertility. Think of it like this. Fertility is the physiological potential to have offspring. Natality is the actual number of offspring that are produced. An animal can be perfectly fertile, but if it can't find a mate or there are no resources, its natality might be 0. It's potential versus reality, a really key difference. Second trap: don't get fooled by crude density. We talked about this, but it's so important. You always have to ask yourself, is all of this area actually usable habitat for the species? If the answer is no, then you have to look at ecological density. That's the number that shows you the real pressures of competition that population is feeling. And the third trap: never, ever forget about that tertiary sex ratio. For most species, a population's growth is ultimately limited by the number of females. A really skewed ratio can seriously handicap a population's ability to grow, even if the total number of animals seems really high. So, if you take one thing away from our discussion today, let it be this idea. These 4 vital signs: density, natality, mortality, and sex ratio, they aren't just a bunch of abstract numbers. They are the tools that, when you put them all together, tell the entire story of a population: its structure, its growth, and its chances of sticking around for the long haul. And that leaves us with one final thought. As our world keeps changing with new pressures from climate or human activity, which of these vital signs do you think is the very first to flash a warning light? Is it a sudden spike in deaths? A slow decline in births? Something to chew on. Thanks so much for joining me.